All right, let's just jump right into this fascinating explainer of a seriously absurd Western novel, The Man with No Self Rides into Town. Now, on the surface, it's a quirky, deadpan story. But what we actually have here is a deep dive into Zen and Taoist philosophies. We're going to unpack exactly how a story about a dusty, nameless cowboy can actually teach us some profound truths about conflict, identity, and, well, our modern obsession with perfection.
So, what happens when a gunfighter's absolute greatest weapon is doing absolutely nothing? It's a total paradox, right? But this question immediately hooks us into the story. We're following this mysterious stranger, a guy whose face has literally forgotten how to be a face. He shows up at a spot perfectly named the Impermanence Inn, right in the middle of a town that sits somewhere between profound meaning and total meaninglessness. This guy isn't your typical gunslinger. He's honestly more like a mirror, just reflecting the sheer absurdity of the world around him.
Part 1. The Setup. The Man with No Self.
We first meet Sheriff Kowalski. And get this, he's a man who leans on things so much he actually forgets the difference between himself and the object he's leaning on. Anyway, the sheriff wants to hire our stranger to solve this deeply rooted local feud. But to really understand the stranger, you've got to understand the concept of a koan. He operates like a walking paradox, a riddle designed to provoke enlightenment through absolute absurdity. He basically carries uncertainty with him everywhere he goes. So the sheriff points him toward the two feuding factions down at Murphy's place. And Murphy's is a saloon that is hilariously described as being simultaneously the easternmost and westernmost building in town, which, you guessed it, depends entirely on your frame of reference.
Part 2. Case Study 1. The Illusion of Conflict. Now, the whole town is paralyzed by a fight where the original disagreement might have been about water rights, or hey, maybe it was about the sunrise. Nobody knows because that initial spark has been completely lost to time. Just look at the absolute absurdity of this conflict. You have the East Siders, led by a guy named Eastman, whose real name, by the way, is actually Johnson, and they are fighting for the strict principle of being right. On the flip side, you've got the West Siders, led by Westman, also named Johnson, and they're fighting for the principle of not being wrong. They're literal mirror images, fiercely defending the exact same arbitrary principles. And this builds an inescapable recursive loop, defending the East versus defending the West. Both of these identities depend entirely on simply not being the other side. They are both fighting about the very principle of fighting. It gets even crazier because both sides secretly try to hire the exact same guy, the stranger, to protect them from each other. It perfectly shows how their tribalism is basically just a snake eating its own tail. They're violently agreeing about fighting.
The source material uses this sharp, deadpan humor to summarize the danger of arbitrary division. It notes that guns are just exclamation points for ideas that don't know how to end themselves. I mean, wow. It perfectly captures what happens when an argument, kind of like your average internet argument today, completely loses its origin, but keeps all its weapons. The conflict literally just becomes a self-sustaining machine.
Part 3. The Paradigm Shift. Existing without opposition.
So to resolve this whole mess without a drop of violence, the stranger gathers everyone in a perfectly circular room right at high noon. Why high noon? Because that's when the sun casts zero-directional shadows, effectively erasing the entire difference between East and West. He uses some classic Socratic questioning to collapse their differences, just dropping this massive realization on them. What if you're not actually fighting each other, but fighting the idea that you have to be fighting someone? He points out that difference and sameness are really just two ways of looking at the exact same thing. He essentially forces these men to realize their deeply held ride-or-die beliefs of being an East Sider or a West Sider are really just hats they arbitrarily decided to put on.
Obviously, when the men realize their entire identities are built on a total paradox, they get incredibly confused. But as the stranger tells them, not understanding is the beginning of understanding. By finally embracing this profound state of confusion, the men just drop the feud. They celebrate by sharing a big pot of stew made by a chef named Cookie. And Cookie wisely notes that ingredients in a stew, much like people, really just want to be allowed to be themselves without constant interference.
So, what are the actual takeaways here? Well, the men drop their old titles and rebrand themselves as the Noon Group. They recognize that they are in fact the exact same group and that they can exist beautifully without needing an opponent. And what about the stranger? He realizes his job was completely successful simply because he made his own employers disappear. By dissolving the very illusion of their separation, the conflict just naturally evaporates into thin air.
Part 4. Case Study 2. The Burden of Perfection.
But the stranger's journey doesn't stop there. Down the road, he meets a woman named Clara at a crossroads, and she guides him to the incredibly optimized, highly efficient town of Paradise. Now, Paradise is a town suffering from a serious excess of satisfaction and a complete shortage of meaningful conflict. Here, we're really exploring our modern obsession with hustle culture and self-optimization. See, Paradise has successfully solved every single problem a town could possibly have, but instead of a glorious utopia, this has led its citizens straight into severe existential burnout. They are literally suffering from the problem of not having any problems.
To put that into perspective, the town's receptionist, Sarah, proudly shares this specific number with the stranger, 9.7 out of 10. That is their official optimal life satisfaction metric. You might be wondering, why not a perfect 10? Well, because they deliberately keep it just below a 10 to prevent total, unmotivated stagnation. They have literally optimized their lives so much that they have to engineer a tiny, artificial fraction of dissatisfaction.
The terrifying efficiency of their lives is just a massive trap. I mean, everything is hyper-optimized. Sweeping a porch, that takes exactly 17 precise strokes. Laughter, they have scheduled humor appreciation time every Tuesday at exactly 2:30 p.m. If you happen to miss the past, you actually have to file Form 23C to formally manage your temporal nostalgia and experiential longing. It's a brilliant, biting critique of how hyper-efficiency completely strips away actual human spontaneity and joy.
Mayor Johnson sums up the town's recursive, bureaucratic nightmare with this incredible quote, describing the problem of having solved the problem of not having problems. You see, because they solved everything, they formed committees to address the lack of problems, which of course solved that problem, dumping them right back into a perfectly optimized, boring void. So now, the mayor is essentially begging the stranger to introduce some fake problems just to give the townspeople something meaningful to wake up for.
Part 5. The Remedy, the Art of Beautiful Mistakes. But instead of creating fake problems just to feed their bureaucratic machine, the stranger introduces a completely radical, paradigm-shifting concept to the citizens of Paradise, a guide to intentional inefficiency. He actually challenges them to do things just because they want to, not because some algorithm or math equation says it's optimal. He tells them to go out and make a beautiful mistake, learn to live with an unsolved problem. He's teaching them that a life that simply works sufficiently is vastly, fundamentally different from a life that is actually lived.
The immediate, messy, and honestly beautiful result of abandoning these rigid metrics is just pure human spontaneity. Mrs. Henderson, she starts planting purple flowers just because her heart prefers the color over the officially climate-optimized palette. Mr. Peterson builds this wildly inefficient, slow, walking speed bicycle just to look at the clouds and enjoy the scenery. The town baker starts creating these asymmetrical, lopsided loaves of bread that somehow bring out genuine smiles in everyone who eats them. And get this? The town clock now rings only when someone actually feels inspired to wind it.
Paradise officially embraces this new philosophy by throwing a massive festival. But it's not a festival of achievement. No, they throw the festival of magnificent failures to celebrate all those experiments that went totally wrong but resulted in discoveries way more interesting than actual success. They're finally learning that being perfectly imperfect is exactly what makes us human.
Hanging right there on a banner in the town square. This quote perfectly summarizes the profound Taoist and Zen messages hidden inside this deeply absurd narrative, where not getting what you expected is more interesting than getting what you wanted. The people of Paradise finally realize that success and perfection are usually the end of the line, right? But failure, confusion, and beautiful mistakes, those are the actual journey itself.
The stranger eventually rides off into a horizon that couldn't care less about east or west. He managed to solve everything by doing absolutely nothing. And in doing so, he reminds all of us to stop over-optimizing, stop drawing arbitrary lines in the sand, and go make our own beautiful mistakes. So, as you go about your day, what magnificent failure will you make today?